Here we have the work of Richard Avedon. Avedon had kind of a dual career in photography. After World War II, he became very famous as a fashion photographer. His fame just kind of grew and grew. For a while, he was doing the cover of Vogue magazine every month, for which he was getting $10,000 each month. So just on that one shoot alone. So he became very famous, very well known and rich from doing his fashion photography. Now, his fashion photography was really very involved with the idea of fantasy, creating these amazing kind of, for instance, he had one photograph he did called Dovima with Elephants, where the fashion model was posing with two circus elephants on each side of her. So just, totally unreal, fantasy-driven kind of imagery. Now, his portrait photography, on the other hand, was the exact opposite. Total realism. Every little nook and cranny of a person's face. Here is a portrait of the artist Marcel Duchamp. And in this picture, great use of gesture. I'm guessing he might have just removed his glasses because it looks like he's rubbing the bridge of his nose there. But that gesture with his fingers up to the side of his face and nose there, very interesting body language there. There is Avedon's Picasso. It's interesting comparing this to the Arnold Newman Picasso picture. The light in this picture is more rugged, more contrasty. Big difference between light and shade in this. It's interesting how, whereas in Newman's Picasso, he's looking right at us, here, Picasso is looking kind of up and over at us, as if there's something up higher there, above us. He's got his interest there. He would use large format cameras, which captured lots of detail. You can see like every pore, every wrinkle, even a few odd hairs coming off of his eyebrow here, in this extreme close-up, filling up the whole frame. George Wallace. Wallace was governor of Alabama for several years back in the 60s. Basically a racist. When desegregation was passed down from the Supreme Court, he tried to oppose it. Said it was a states' rights issue. It had nothing to do with racism. It was all to do with states being able to do what they want, which really was about racism. Now, kind of like with Newman's picture of Krupp, Avedon did not like Wallace. I've seen other pictures from this shoot where Wallace is smiling and looking, relaxed and such. And I'm guessing Avedon actually said something to kind of take a poke at him here, because this is not a happy expression. He looks kind of arrogant, kind of snide, which is what Avedon wanted to do. He did not want to show him in a good light. It's interesting comparing this arch super conservative with Allen Ginsberg, far left poet of the 1950s and 60s. In this picture, you talk about how clothing can symbolize a lot in a photograph, sometimes the lack of clothing. The idea that he is a very free spirit. I think it's interesting comparing these two portraits. So, interesting how he's pledging allegiance with his right hand while cupping his invisible private parts there with his right one there. Now, Avedon is not an environmental photographer. He would shoot people against a plain white backdrop in the studio, and the composition was basically how the person fit into the frame. Here we have a portrait of another writer, Truman Capote. Interesting expression with the narrowed eyes, the slight tilt of his head. And again, you can see the really super detail, that Avedon's work would capture. Another writer, another contemporary of Allen Ginsberg. This is William Burroughs, member of the so-called Beat generation of the 1950s. It's interesting, Ginsberg, as you can see, became a total full-on hippie with the advent of the 60s. But back in the 50s, these most radical left writers were still, wearing business suits, which is basically what men's attire was back then. It wasn't until the 1960s that basically fashion and daily wear became much less formal. Interesting expression. Burroughs was a junkie. He was a heroin addict. And he was really one most of his life. He never really tried to get out of it. And you can kind of see that wear in his face, the effect of long-term drug abuse here. It's kind of ironic, this person, a drug addict, and looks like an accountant in some ways. Interesting gesture too, with the arm coming down to that thumb to index finger gesture there. Marilyn Monroe. Now, you might not have known who some of these other people are, but I'll bet you know who Marilyn Monroe is. Everyone does. 50 years after her death, still very famous fashion icon, a pop icon. We still see her movies on TV. Now, whenever you see a picture of Monroe, it's usually the party girl, happy, laughing, jumping about. This is the other Monroe, the tragic Monroe, the one who had several failed marriages, who was very insecure despite her success, and who died of a pill overdose right in the middle of her life. Look at the expression on her, just kind of staring into space, the half-open mouth, the shoulders. I've seen other pictures from this same shoot, where she's wearing the same dress, and she's jumping, she's laughing. But just for a split second, Avedon caught her letting her guard down and caught this very revealing portrait of her. Now, one of the criticisms of Avedon was that, well, if I was photographing Marilyn Monroe and William Burroughs and all these fascinating people, I'd have great pictures too. I mean, they're fascinating people. How could you not? So I think partly as a response to this, Avedon loaded up a van in the early 80s, took a few assistants with him, and started photographing the exact opposites. Nobodies, the unknowns, the anonymous people. After doing this for a couple years, he put together a book, which he called In the American West. Now, the title is interesting, because it refers to part of our American mythology, the idea of the West, the idea of this big limitless land where you could always pull up stakes and move on, and, a land of unlimited opportunity. Well, in Avedon's West, it's the end of the road. This was done during a depression that was happening during the early 80s. And what we see are drifters, unemployed, carnival workers, all these people basically scrapping to get by. This portrait is of an unemployed copper mine worker and his wife. There is a carnival worker, Carney. And you see kind of half smirk on his face. It's almost like he's sizing Avedon up to wonder what he can grift him out of. Ranch hand, a cowboy, a real cowboy, not someone just getting dressed up for Saturday night down at the cowboy bar. You can see the wear in his clothes, the wear in his skin and face. I found out this guy was actually in his early 20s, and yet, from being out in the sun all the time, the wind, the rain, he looks a good 10 years older. A future member of the NRA. Yeah. Physical therapist, Butte, Montana. I like comparing this picture to the next one, another Carney. Now, car workers are supposed to be kind of shady characters, tough guys, and you look at this guy and you can see the things like the wallet on a chain. I mean, why would you wear your wallet on a chain? Well, maybe because he goes to places he worries somebody might pick his pocket, try to run off with it. That says something about the kind of crowd he runs with. And yet, it's interesting. The body language and the expression of this is not of someone who's, strong and ready to take you on. I mean, he looks, he's looking down, just barely up at us underneath those thick eyebrows. Compare this body language and expression to the physical therapist. She's standing straight on. You know, she's staring straight out at us, very set expression. You know, to me, she seems like the stronger, more confident person than the Carney here. Drifter. This is a man Avedon literally found by the side of the road, hitchhiking from town to town. Look at how he's fit him into the frame. How the left side, his shoulder perfectly lines up with the left side of the frame, his head just barely within the top, how his elbow reaches out to the right side of the frame. You know, his body language and position in the frame is the composition. And look at his face. Look at all the age spots, the wrinkles, the toughness, again, from, you know, being out in the wind and elements all the time. This man here, who's got some strange bumps on his shoulders where it should be smooth and has had some operations on his neck, was born around the time of some nuclear testing that was going on out west. After World War II, there was a lot of open air nuclear testing, and this is above ground. You know, people had the attitude, the Army had the attitude, it's a desert, nobody lives out there. But there are some small towns and places out in that place, and sometimes the fallout went the wrong way, and he thinks his issues were a result of being exposed to radiation from these tests when he was a child. Beekeeper. Avedon does have a knack for getting the dramatic shot. I mean, this guy just literally covered with bees, that almost paper white skin against the dark shape of the bees crawling all over him. Oil field worker. I mean, look at this guy. I mean, just talk about a filthy job working on these derricks. You hit a gusher, you get mud and oil splashed all over you. I mean, just caked on his arms and chest, splattered all over his face. And yet, an interesting side note here, notice his beard. Notice how finely trimmed that is. You know, a beard like that, you have to trim every day, you know, to keep just like that. This suggests to me that when he's away from his totally filthy job, he reacts just the opposite. You know, he steam cleans himself and is probably very fastidious, you know, about how he looks.